So today we have Wolfgang Streeck with us. He is a political economist, a sociologist, and emeritus director of the Max Planck Institute for the Studies of Societies in Cologne. He was an assistant professor at the University of Munster and a professor of sociology and industrial relations at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He is a corresponding member of the British Academy and an honorary fellow of the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics. Would you like to add anything about yourself?
No, no, that's fine.
So there are a lot of young graduates who are now getting into the job market, and they're finding it very difficult to sort of get jobs, etc. So do you have any advice for young graduates?
See, every generation faces a different situation, and now I'm old. When I was young and entering the profession, the world was a different world. But there is maybe some uh, common ground in when it comes to a life of scholarship. You have to expect that you won't get rich. Maybe you already are rich because your parents are, but in your profession you won't become a rich man or a rich woman. Now, why do this? You have to look into yourself and discover whether this is something that you want to do out of your own desire to do scholarly work. Uh, this is absolutely essential. You have to be a devoted scholar. Otherwise, this life is not for you. You can go to a bank, you can be a lawyer, you can do whatever you want. Uh, but scholarship is special, and it has a great privilege. It combines your passion with your earning your livelihood, uh, but you take risks. And also in some countries, these are personal risks. If you do not have the right, if you do not come to the conclusions that your government comes to, then you may have difficulties. You have to know all this, and if in spite of all this, you still want to do it, then you're welcome to the club.
And what was your biggest challenge in your career?
No, I don't know. This is always challenge if you do research and if you want to produce something original, something that adds to the existing knowledge, then it is hard work. There's sort of, as I think Albert Einstein used to say, 95% sweat and 5% in genius. Yeah, but it is a challenge all the time, and it is bearable because it's also fun for yourself. Maybe others don't see the fun, but as long as you see it, that's all right. So no, I couldn't. I couldn't identify a particular challenge.
We're now going to transition to expert matter questions. So you wrote a book about how capitalism will end. So I wanted to ask you, what would be the sort of textbook definition of neoliberalism and capitalism? And then I would like to ask you the question, how will capitalism or neoliberalism end?
Yeah, neoliberalism is a stage in the development of capitalism, and capitalism is an economic regime and a social order that originated in Europe roughly 500 years ago. And it's a historical phenomenon. It's spread all over the world. It has a beginning, and everything that has a beginning also has an end. History never stops. Uh, Now, how this end will come about and what it will look like, we are very well advised to think about it in order to understand the dynamics of our time, the historical dynamics of our time. I could give you a lecture on what capitalism is. That would be about 5 hours introduction. So I would urge your readers to take a look, but very essentially, a capitalist economy is one that is geared towards the uninterrupted production of capital that can be invested in order to generate more capital. Yeah. In other words, it's an open-ended growth machine, but not for food stuff or for cannonballs. Capital, which is universally applicable. You can invest it wherever you want. And the capitalist society is one whose well-being and social cohesion depends on the success of a capitalist economy. If you live in a capitalist society and then the process of capital accumulation, economic growth is interrupted, then you're in for a very hard time. From starvation to a civil war, to revolutions or whatever. The stability, the livelihood, the culture of a capitalist society depends on the success of its capitalist economy. And then you ask, what is neoliberal capitalism? It's a stage in the development of capitalism after the sort of social democratic period after the Second World War, or the socialist experimentation with some social element to inside this capitalist growth machine. Now it was an attempt to, well, you can say, make markets and competition the only mechanisms to govern social lives. Yeah, more traditional societies, there's something else like honor, religion, family tradition, and so on. Neoliberal capitalism tries to wipe out all of this or put it second place, and the most important thing is to be competitive in markets and international markets.
Very interesting. And so you then wrote that, so how sort of will, you've argued, for example, that the current day capitalism isn't working. So, and it's causing inequality, I believe, and that can further cause social unrest. So what kind of unrest can it result in? And what steps can be taken to reverse this trend?
I'm not into the steps to be taken industry. I analyze what is going on. It would be, I think, if you ever meet someone who has a recipe for healing the world of its problems, then don't believe him. It will probably be someone who wants to get money from you. The thing that you're asking for is probably this. See, capitalist societies are not just markets, but also societies. That's interesting because human beings are not easily reduced to rational income maximizers. They have families. They believe in God, or whoever God may be, where they are. And to the extent that the imperatives of the market are in conflict with the imperatives of social life. Your idea of the spiritual, your family obligations. In that moment, there is a conflict between social norms and capitalist rationality. Societies have, for example, societies all over the world get suspicious if there are too many people in their society who are cut off from elementary social needs like health, public education, and so on. And if you organize the education system or the healthcare system as a profit-making enterprise, then there will be more and more people who do not get the services to which that society believes they are entitled. And that is perceived as growing inequality. And where it is so perceived, then there will be social conflict. Groups will organize. Human beings demand representation. And the ruling classes who draw all the benefits from the economic system, and the lower classes who are basically excluded from them, who are only expected to work, but not to share in the product, the capital. Those people and those two classes of people will clash in one way or other. And then you get unstable politics. And this is dangerous for the lives of people, as we all know. Bombs can explode, guns are shot, people get at each other's throats. And you know, in all our societies, capitalist and pre-capitalist, there is this idea that the king, the government, the state, the democratic government are charged with preserving some sort of social stability and security and equality, inclusion in citizenship or earlier forms of communality. Yeah. And if they cannot do this, because they are dictated by the principle of capital accumulation, that certain things cannot be done for people, then you will experience extreme social instability, and governments and states will lose their legitimacy. And just look around and you see all over the world that this is a process of sort of disrupting societies and depriving states of their capacity to govern and to create some sort of social equity. Yeah? That's a crisis, a capitalist crisis. How will it end? But it's your question. It's up to you to ask, not to me.
Very interesting. So, but do you think though that, so you see, if you compare Western countries right now to non-Western countries, the standard of living is still much, much higher. You still have higher access to education. You have higher levels of access to healthcare. You have all these things that I would say hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of people don't have. And I understand that maybe the relative standard of living is decreasing or something like that. But would it not be odd to see countries that have all these things to be more upset than countries that don't have any of this? So I see even more like perturbance within developed countries, which have so much more than third world countries I've personally visited. So what is what do you think is the reason for this?
This is a very good question, but as a sociologist, I would say people live in societies and compare themselves to the rest of their society. That's the first thing. And then if you talk about wealth and prosperity, it's always useful not to talk of countries as a whole. In a country like, if you want, Pakistan or India, there are enormously rich people, uh, people who are maybe richer than anyone in a country like Germany or Britain. Yes. And at the same time, if you go to London and you look at the immigrants from Pakistan or other places, then you can see that they really live a miserable life. Yes. And the life is then always sort of measured against the background of the existing society. So if you live in England, you may have a daily income in terms of pounds or whatever that is far above the income of your brother who has remained back in India or in Africa. But but then you live in a society in which getting access to food is not something that you can share in your family because your family is not there. You have to go to a shop and buy, and then the money is gone. Or you have to live somewhere and then you have to pay rent for it. Yes. Moreover, as you started your very, very important question, where do these differences come from? Then, of course, the Western societies were first. They, in this long process of the transition from traditional society to capitalist society, we started before you. Not only that, uh, the fact that countries in the so-called third world did not experience the same process of development as capitalist, as the European or American societies, is that they had to live next to these powerful modernizing societies. They saw their ships coming in and their guns and the attempt to exploit the labor force of these countries to have cheaper textiles in England or in Europe. You know this whole story. So the development of the third world is not something that takes place like in a silo, like in these other. The wealth of the first developers and the poverty of the late developers have something to do with each other. Yeah, that raises the question of an equitable, just international economy, or call it trade regime. What sort of trade regime gives countries that are lagging behind a fair chance to catch up? Yes, is it international free trade according to the rules of the World Trade Organization, or is it some more selective engagement with the global economy? For example, that countries with a strong subsistence agriculture will be protected from agricultural imports from countries with industrialized agriculture, so that they can slowly grow out of an agricultural and not be overwhelmed by the competitive advantage of their trade partners. These are then the relevant questions, and I may add that maybe the tragedy is that when these negotiations take place about equitable trade regimes, then the poorer countries are represented not by the poor masses that live in these countries, but by an elite that, to a very large extent, has already achieved the wealth of the old industrial countries. And they are interested in importing, let's say, deep freeze pizzas for their family, whereas the rest of their country cannot afford deep freeze pizzas, and in my view shouldn't, because they have much better ways to feed their children and their families than with deep freezed pizzas from Germany, right?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Um, so I'd like to move on to ask about deglobalization. So a lot of
About
people
about you asked me?
deglobalization, deglobalization.
Yeah.
So what effects will increasing trade barriers, sanctions, delinking of economies have on consumers, technological advancements, and geopolitics?
Yeah, this is again a very blanket question, and you can easily say at the beginning it will have different effects in different places. Yeah. Uh, now, if you want to generalize, then in a very technical sense, uh, these long chains, these long production chains, for example, medications that we get here in Germany, to a large extent, are produced, or the raw materials for them, the materials for them, are produced in China. In China, they can be produced much cheaper than they could in Europe. As a result, the medications that are built with the help of these long delivery production chains, value chains, are cheaper. Yes. Now, if we are forced, or if we decide to, also for reasons of security of access, if we decide to produce our medications ourselves, then they will cost more. Yeah. And at the same time, in China, we don't know. Will the workers that work, that produce these materials, will they find other jobs or not? What will be the political and social consequence? In my view, the development of developing societies, that's the term that people use, so I use it too. The development of these societies will depend on the products, the value added in your own production increasing. Less dependence on the stuff that you buy elsewhere, and more capacity to produce high-value products in your own country. In other words, that's an infrastructure problem. You need to have an education system so that people learn how to do complicated work. There are countries with an excellent education system, but then the second question is missing. Or some countries' upper classes sit on a huge pile of money, but they do not invest it in their own countries, partly because they don't believe in the political stability of the country. Now, if you have a very highly educated workforce, especially in the middle class, and you know what countries I'm talking about, but you have no investment in production, then these people sort of sit on the street. They have learned to program some of the most complicated computer programs, but there's nobody who wants them to work for them. Yeah, which then raises the next question: can the government provide for work opportunities for a highly skilled national workforce if capital doesn't do it? And then you see that capital is a very sort of shy animal. As soon as the government begins to say, we want to take your capital and invest it by the state, then the money is gone, because there is an international capital system. And the Indian money or the Pakistani money or whatever ends up in a Swiss bank account because it runs away. Yeah. Or the government begins to borrow money on international markets in order to provide for some investment. And you will see that in international markets become relatively early, become suspicious whether they will get their money back. And then interest rates sort of shoot up. So it's a complicated thing. What I want to say is that, in my view, if this enormous gap in development can be overcome, then you need two things at the same time: a more equitable international trade regime and more equity within countries, where the huge oligarchs, who own the country's capital, cannot push it, take it with them if they go to London and buy a big house for them. Yes, that money should be invested in the country where it is urgently needed.
Interesting. And in terms of the financial sort of future financial order, in terms of trade, do you think currencies, like there will be changes within the dollar use, or will crypto be increasingly used, or is gold going to be used? Like, what do you think is going to be the future sort of financial world order of financial systems?
See, if I knew this, I would be as rich as Elon Musk. Yes, but let me say something about money. Yeah, in a capitalist world, money is probably the most important social and economic institution. There's nothing more important than money. Money runs the world. So far, so good. But do you know what money is? If you look at the literature, what money is, you will see that the brightest minds disagree on the nature of money. Is it private? Is it private debt? Is it public debt? Is it exclusively public money, or is money also created by private banks? Is money now just simply some sort of figures in a blockchain, or is it money on the electronic books of a bank? How does it circulate? How much money is there in the first place? We don't really know. There are three different measures of money: M1, M2, M3. They all sort of, and most importantly, central banks then sometimes think that they can control the amount of money. No, it seems to control itself. It seems to have a life of its own. For example, throughout, I'm now speaking about the West, throughout the Western history, beginning with the Greeks 400, 500 years before the Common Era, when they began to make coins, gold coins, and so on. There was always this mystery: is money the material value of money, or the symbolic value of money? How is it enforced? Where does inflation come from? These are not new questions. They are questions that are now 2,500 years old. And during the time, the nature of money has increasingly changed. It became more and more dematerialized. Yes, originally, I mean, in some we call it primitive or original societies, then the only currency were camels, but not the cigarettes, the animals. Yeah. But if you wanted to buy a bride, you had to pay 3 camels. But if you wanted to buy a pound of meat, it's difficult to pay in the camel currency. Yes, take the camel apart, and then either you can, but then it's dead. And if you don't have a refrigerator, that's a bad time. And so now what happens then? People begin to think about how we can organize this sort of bargain with small coins, and then they invent the other systems, other materials. But at some point, the material steps into the background, and there's no longer gold in the pound, or there's no silver anymore in sterling. But nevertheless, people accept that thing as money. Why do they do that? it's something that is a very interesting question for sociologists and historians. And how does this evolve over time? So now you're asking the question, what is the money of the future? And I will tell you that I think now we have one big global money, which is the dollar. Yeah. And why is it so big and global? Because the United States can produce money without any limit, because everybody takes it. Yeah? People all over the world have money under their pillow, in their bed. It's all dollars. Yeah? That may not last forever. Yes? Who tells you? If the United States make some big mistake in their monetary policy, then suddenly confidence in the dollar will disappear, and then you get an economic crash all over the world with a result that we don't know. Yeah, we don't know what happens, because it has never happened before. So we have the dollar. At the same time, we have private cryptocurrencies that are being invented to circumvent the dollar. Then we have the Chinese, who do not want to be subject to the dollar and invent their own thing, although it is not yet a reserve currency. Not many countries use it. But the Chinese are making an effort. At the same time, the Americans tell everyone who wants to use the Chinese currency as a reserve currency to please go to hell and don't do it, because we don't want it. Yes, the Germans and the Europeans for a while tried to bring in the euro as another reserve currency that everybody accepts, that especially the central banks accept. We will see how the Americans respond to this. They are not happy about it. Yeah, so it's intertwined. It's the nature of money, and it is different forces that want different monies, and then it is a regulatory regime that brings together central bank money and private bank money, and these are in some way intertwined. And you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of historians, economists, and so on, who try to understand what is going on there and have very different views on it.
Very interesting, yeah. So you touched upon, sort of the money supply and how central banks believe that they have control over that. But I would like to ask what the effect of quantitative easing and interest rates are on inflation or the money supply.
Yeah, that's another question that people are puzzling about. You have very different views among economists on it. Some believe, for example, up to, let's say, 2 years ago, it was opinio communis, as we say in Latin. It was a general assumption that inflation was dead once and for all. It will never happen again, because we know how to control it. Then suddenly it was there. Then people began to think, what might be the cause of this? And basically, I think there is some suspicion that the unending creation of money in the last, let's say, 10, 15 years after the first after the global financial crisis of 2008, where the central banks and the private banks and the states, by borrowing, infused huge amounts of money into the economy, without this resulting in inflation. Everybody would have thought it should have, because there was so much money around now. Then now there's a suspicion there are some people or some banks or some institutes who are sitting on this stuff, or used to be sitting on this stuff and were hoarding the money. And now they are becoming nervous, and they want to get something for the money, and they go into the market, and suddenly there's inflation back. Yeah. So, for example, who owns all this debt that is being accumulated? What do they use? What do they do with it? What do they expect to do with it in the future? We don't know. Because we could go and interview the Silicon Valley sort of big money guys. Yeah, will they tell us what they think? No, it's even worse. They don't even know themselves how the world is coming. They only have some different opportunities because they have so much money. If something explodes here, then why? Not so important. Then there's something else where they also have money and that growth. But this can only be happen if you have a lot of money already. Yes. No. I think the mystery of what the money regime of the future will be is something that nobody at this point can solve, except that I strongly believe that at some point there will be a moment in which there has to be a repetition of a very important historical event, the Conference of Bretton Woods in 1944, when, under the advice of John Maynard Keynes, the Anglos, especially the Americans and the British, created a new global money system. Yeah? That had not existed before. And that after, but this was possible after the war. That is after the devastating war that I think 50 million people all over the world were killed. And countries were totally exhausted and nobody wanted more. And then suddenly you could do this. The question is whether in peacetime you will be able to repeat this sort of fundamental reform of the most important institution of our modern societies, which is money. And my fear is that in peacetime you cannot do it, and that it may require another war. and yeah, look, the Americans and the Chinese are already looking at each other, and they expect that the other side will start a war on them. And maybe after such an event, there can be the great cleaning up of this whole mess and some fresh start. I'm not saying that because I want to advise it, but I'm quite.
Yeah, this is your prediction. I understand.
Yeah,
Okay.
but
Wow.
I'm saying that the major transformations, the two last major transformations of the capitalist economy and the global capitalist system, happened in 1918 and in 1945, and these happened to be the final years of the First World War and of the Second World. Yeah.
Okay. 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 Let's hope it doesn't get to
Yeah,
that.
let's hope.
Yeah, that would be very, very, yeah, cause a lot of problems for the world. And then I'd like to ask you about your view on sort of AI and ChatGPT and the effect on the economy. So what do you think? I'm reading these news about how it's giving crazy answers and stuff like that. But at the same time, I think if you want to break the system, it's not going to work, right? But overall, it seems to be working quite well. So what's your opinion on this?
See, I'm a modest sociologist, not a technician. I have no idea how these things are programmed and how they are produced. But I have two general views on it, and they may be the first may be mistaken just because I don't know much about these things. But the first one is this: human creativity cannot be replaced by machines. So, what these? I have used this new thing, chat such and such, for two or three occasions. Like, I told it, tell me about myself, about my work. This is something I could control. The machine did a very reasonable job. Yeah, but linking it beyond what the machine knew about me, which I also knew, which other people could also know if they made an effort. Linking it below this or above this to the question of whether this is a sensible contribution to the improvement of science, social life, and so on. The machine doesn't know this. It's something that also needs to evolve over time. Yeah. For example, when I ask a particular question, it told me that his training or her training or whatever had stopped in 2020, and unfortunately, beyond that, they couldn't say anything. Good. I would think it can be very useful in the following sense. If you start to work on something, you can ask the machine to tell you, what do we know about X and Y? And they will do a reasonable job. And then it's your job to do something creative on top of it, to improve on it, to see where something else should be done. And this is a creative act that a machine cannot do. Yeah? So there I'm pretty optimistic. My research assistant will have a problem because now I tell him, get me everything that we know on this and that, and do it in 3 weeks. And from now on, I will ask ChatGPT. But then my work begins. That's my first answer. More to the point, this is the answer of a scholar. So I'm relatively optimistic. Secondly, as a sociologist, I'm not optimistic at all in the following sense. These machines can store so much data and so much information on individuals that an old dream of dictators, dictatorial regimes is coming true, that you can know about everyone, single individual in your society. Yeah? The dream or the nightmare of individualized social control. Yeah, not just a group. Those group of people who have these ideas. No, individuals. And of course, we have to find ways of preventing that our governments acquire this capacity to look into the activities of each and every individual citizen in their society, even if it's 80 million people. Yeah? How do you do that? How do you prevent the government or the state or whoever, the dictator, whoever the dictator may be, from doing this? If they tell you that, look, we can make flight travel much easier, we can protect you from terrorism, we can do this and we can do that, and please let us do this little thing, and then it's basta. But then they find out next year that they can do something else, and they can also look at your health records and at your school diplomas and everything. They can put everything together, make a complete picture of you, and how nice it would be to know the next terrorist, who he is going to terrorize next, because we can identify him. Yeah, and we have to learn to deny our governments these wonderful opportunities, because otherwise we really could live in a nightmare. Yeah, the enormous, unending amounts of data that they can store and that they can process, that is frightening.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And exactly the pretext you gave is what I thought was the pretext that would be used. So I'm going to move on to ask some questions about your personal interests. So I wanted to ask you what the most interesting book you've ever read is.
Yeah, I read many interesting books, and I'm now 77 years old, so you can imagine that during more than 60 years I read, but I try to give you an answer that is at least an honest answer. So One of the books that I really was always fascinated with was Gibbon, Edward Gibbon's history of the decline and fall of the Western Roman Empire, written at the end of the 18th century. Gibbon was the first serious historian after the great Greek historian Thucydides. You can say that with some degree of confidence. He wrote an absolutely beautiful English, and this history is 6 or 7 volumes. Begins in the middle of the 2nd century, and then ends in the 6th or 7th century when the Western Roman Empire finally ended. And it's just, this guy knew everything. He knew all the languages of the time, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, whatever. He read all the sources that were at the time available. So it's a breathtaking experience to read this book. Yeah. Then another one, I think more recent, is Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation. Polanyi was an economic historian who lived in the first half of the last century, of the 20th century. He was a Hungarian, then lived in Austria, then went to the United States, of Jewish descent, therefore happy to escape from European and anti-Semitism. He wrote a history of the market economy and how the market economy in the West began to intertwine with social life, and what the limits of markets are, and why there is a good reason for socialist control of excessive capitalism. He's basically the polar opponent of someone like Friedrich von Hayek. They both lived in Vienna in the 1920s, and they were already fighting with each other over the future of capitalism. So let me name you the two, Gibbon and Polanyi, both historians. Polanyi, in addition, a great economist. That's my answer.
Thank you. And what is your view on spirituality? So, at least in my experience, a lot of young people, at least while I was at university, especially in sciences, they view spirituality as just like illogical. It has no place in the world anymore, stuff like that. What is your view on that? Do you think spirituality has value, or it provides anything to society, or do you think it has a negative impact? What is your view?
It depends on what you mean by it. Yes. So let me say that as a sort of secular European of the 20th century, the idea that I mean, I've seen Europeans going to Asia and sort of using these little smoke things and singing Indian songs in Indian places. I found this ridiculous. That is not what you probably mean when you say spirituality. What I mean is there a capacity in a human being to be deeply touched by an idea, a normative principle, an obligation, or a duty as a human being that you cannot shed, so that you begin to see yourself not just as an egoistic maximizer of your own interests, but as someone in a larger context in which you have an obligation to other people, and an unshakable obligation, one that cannot be bought of you. If you mean that by spirituality, and the capacity to to feel this deeply, so that you come to the conclusion that there are obligations that I have in life that I will never give up regardless of what happens. Yeah? And it can be devotion to the truth. It can be devotion to the life of other people. A principle that I do not hit people who are weaker than I am. Yeah. Fairness. All of these things are not just practical everyday things, but they are anchored in some image of yourself as an individual and as a member of a community. And this anchorage is what you could probably call, in my view, spirituality.
And this brings me to the last question. What do you think is the purpose of life?
There is no purpose. No.
Really?
No. Life is such a strange thing that I think we're unable to know about it. It is life on Earth is millions and millions of years old, and it has evolved through so many different forms. It has survived so many catastrophic changes in our environment. Is there some destiny to it? Well, it's like, you see, we're three-dimensional beings, but maybe there's a fourth dimension. Then by definition, we cannot know about it. It is something that is beyond our knowledge. So then it comes to a point where, as I said before, where you have to guess what your destiny in life might be, and how behavior to other people and to nature and to the society as a whole might have some higher meaning that you cannot be certain of, but you should sort of try to at least understand it, to get a sense that there might be something there. It's a bet. Yeah. In theology, Catholic theology, there's this idea of the bet: is there a God? You don't know, says Pascal, but it would be better to assume that there is one, for all practical purposes, rather than assume that there's none. Because if there is one, assuming that there is none, you deprive yourself of something, and he might get angry at you. So it's it's a sort of a guess thing, and I urge you to assume that there is some meaning to what you're doing that transcends yourself, but don't expect to be sure what it is.
That was one of the most interesting answers I've ever gotten on this question. So thank you very much for coming on the show. I'm very grateful to have you on, and you're welcome to come back at any time. It's been an absolute honor. It's been an absolute honor to have you on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming on the show. This was the Intrastellar podcast with Shoaib Hussain. Please like, share, and subscribe, and click the notification button. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again.